Hi guys. Can you guys hear me? Oh, sorry guys. Can you guys hear me? Can someone confirm if they can hear me? Thanks, Sipo. Can you hear me though? Guys, I'm not sure if I'm audible. Can you hear me? Thanks, Sipo. Thank you. All right. We had some technical
Done.
glitches trying to.
Done.
Yay!
Done. Finally, thank
So
goodness.
sorry, friend, about that. I'm so sorry.
No worries. It happens to the best of us. I think the connection and stuff like that. But I guess.
Yes.
Oh no! In fact, I know why. Your account is private, and I think the live issue.
Oh,
Maybe the
oh.
the 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 problem. You need to make it
Yes.
public, and
Okay.
it's a public figure. Oh,
Some things must remain private.
oh, yes, I see. Especially some pictures, some things, and all of those
No, but
things. But
also just to cultivate that private space, hey?
this is true. No, this is absolutely true. And I hear you. How are you doing?
I'm good. I'm good. How are you? Hi, everyone. So sorry that so much time has elapsed whilst we were trying to sort out the technical glitches. But
Yeah.
thanks to me for indulging me, and thanks to everyone for your patience and tips.
No worries. I think we all pulled together, and we will obviously just make the session, shorter and to the point.
Yes. Yeah.
We have 10 people for now. Let's just maybe wait until we probably get to 20 or so. But yeah,
Okay, cool.
thank you for indulging.
And how I'm good. How are you? So now, what about the people on your end? Will they be able to connect?
Yeah, they will be. They
Okay,
are seeing
cool.
that I'm live. I can see, they joining as well. So what
Okay,
Instagram
great.
send notification to people and stuff like that.
Okay. All right.
Yeah.
Because we don't want to compromise your following.
No, not at all. I don't have as much on this side of the world, and I think Instagram is calmer as compared to Twitter.
Yeah,
The
it
thing is,
is.
if we were there, someone else could be coming in and selling us stuff
Of
and all of those
course.
things. But here we can control what's been said and how it's been said, really.
Okay, cool. I'll let you lead the conversation then.
Yeah, so we have at least 14 people. Maybe some people will join or otherwise, but I think
Yeah.
we can begin. Thank you very much, Tholoana, for agreeing to having this Instagram live session with me. So what I normally do is, I started this one, I think 2 weeks or 3 months ago. I don't remember, where I was chilling. It was at night, and I've never done a live session. And I went live. People were there, and I think it was
Okay.
during the first week lockdown, and we
Oh,
started
okay.
a conversation with the people, and people said this is something that they could be interested in. And the point
Okay,
really is
cool.
just to inform people, is just to give them some knowledge and information that ordinarily they would have to pay for. But I think we
Okay.
play an important role in terms of sharing this type of information, and that's why
Yeah.
we other things. Great stuff. So guys,
Cool.
those who don't know Tholoana, we actually go way back. We worked at the same firm years ago, and Tholoana was in the tax department that subsequently left and went elsewhere. And she was also one from the auditing firms, as far as I recall. Ne? I remember,
Yes.
yes, definitely. But just to do a high level, she's an admitted attorney, and she specializes in media and telecommunications law, and it includes international trade law, administrative law, and litigation. So, mainly amongst others. But of late, she's been playing an integral role in the development on policies and legislation relating to regulating social media content in South Africa. She's advised multinationals, media companies, and corporations in relation to SA media law and technology. She also does work for government entities and regulators, and presents on a wide range of forums. Parliament, she's been there, and she also lectures at experts at times on regulatory and digital media policy issues. So it's, proper expert in this type of field. And thank you once again for, indulging us and spending time with us. The topic for today really is the Copyright Amendment Bill. And I think it comes in nicely when last week during this Instagram session, we're speaking to Advocate Mxolisi, where we're just talking about intellectual property in general. And,
Right.
just to tie it in nicely, I think we looked at some of the practical aspects of it and what it means. But I think before we even go into what is this bill and stuff like that, if you could just maybe explain, amongst other things, if someone talks about copyright in simple
Yeah.
terms, what would it be, for someone who's not a lawyer or otherwise?
Great. And I think I must just say that the issue pertaining to intellectual property is quite technical.
Yeah,
So it's sometimes very difficult to get away from the legalese. But essentially, every single thing that you create, whether it's a picture that you draw, whether it's a song that you write, whether actually it's just even this session in itself, all of all of the products of your intellect have some rights pertaining to them. So the minute you've created something, you have created what is called intellectual property. And the law as it currently stands is once you have created it, you automatically own the rights pertaining to that intellectual property. So only you can determine who can then use it. Only you then have the rights to sell it, to make it available to someone else, to export it. When it comes to now then wanting to commercialize that particular intellectual property, that's
yeah,
where your copyright legislation, if I can put it like that, becomes quite important, because it is the one that will lay the framework as to if there are going to be royalty payments, what are the royalty payments that are due, if there are issues around disputes, where would you go and where would you seek recourse? So copyright is a subset of intellectual property. You also have patents. So if you were to talk to the telecommunications sector, there'd be a lot
mm,
of patents there because that pertains to inventions. But
yeah,
copyright, it's really your creative work. So it's the intellectual property rights pertaining to creative works, be it a song, be it a film, be it
yeah.
a script. All of that work would be protected under copyright.
Great stuff. Thank you so much. And I think I like that distinction between patents and copyrights, although that falls within the bigger scope of intellectual property. And what
Yes.
you have also seen as well is, this copyright amendment bill, which I'll call the bill going forward, has been a cause of contention, right? On Twitter,
Mm,
a few months ago, there were artists, creatives, for example, coming in and talking about the impact and how the minister should sign this, or people should send through their voices. And it wasn't for me at the time clear as to what the cry was. There were
mm,
instances of exploitation and all
yeah.
of that. But from a high level perspective, what does this bill deal with before we talk
Okay.
about changes and stuff like that?
Sure. So first of all, it's quite important to note that it's a 1976 piece of legislation. And you can
Yeah,
imagine sitting here in 2020, so much has changed. Some of us can't even imagine what it must have been like during the time
yeah,
that the legislation was drafted. And so it was drafted at a very particular point in time where the level of commercialization pertaining to copyrighted works was not as extensive as we have it now. And
yeah,
certainly technology was not as we experience it today. And also, South Africa was not a party to the number of treaties that we have today. And
right.
even just the ability to just create content and commercialize content, the commercial scope was not as extensive as it was today. So
Yeah,
whilst there have been some amendments during the course of the year, the entire framework has to change. And
hmm,
so that is really what the Copyright Amendment Bill seeks to do. It really seeks to, one, ensure that South Africa's legislation aligns with the treaties that South Africa is a party to.
yeah,
Secondly, it seeks to ensure, as you said to me, there's always been this cry that artists are dying as paupers, and they've
yes,
felt that the Copyright Act, excuse me, in its current form, doesn't really give them the ability to completely monetize their moral and economic rights pertaining to their works.
Right.
And then there's also been issues as looking at the exceptions, because as you know, in law, there'll always be an exception. So
Yes.
whilst ordinarily, in order to make use of a copyrighted work, you would have to pay royalties, what about those particular instances where you're using the work for research purposes, where you're using
Yes.
the work as we are now in a discussion? You know, it shouldn't be expected that at every single time that we use what is copyrighted work, we should then pay a royalty. So those are some
Okay.
of the things that we've been looking at, and that's why there's been such a divergence of views,
Yeah.
because whilst of course there are exceptions on one hand, there's been what they now call the fair use provision, where much as the publishers understand that their works must be made available for academic purposes, some of the provisions of the bill go a bit too far as far as the scope of the exception is concerned. And for them, their
Yeah.
concern then becomes that they won't be able to monetize their content. So
Okay.
it's just that's the high level overview that I can give to you
What the
now.
bill is. Okay, great stuff.
Yes.
And thanks for that, because I mean, at the end of the day, you spoke about exceptions, and I want us just to, just after this question, deal with what are these exceptions amongst other things. But for an artist who either is joining this call and hears about the copyright amendment bill amongst other things, and someone who's, you'd see on Twitter someone producing content and some of
Yes.
it going viral and stuff like that. Does this bill at the very least at least take into account those type of instances? Or someone would have to either be signed with a record label or work for a company. And I ask this because if you look at some of the employment contract, there's a copyright or intellectual property clause amongst other things.
Yeah.
So,
Yes.
what then of content creators, people who are in the digital space and stuff like that? Would this bill at least be something that they should be interested in?
Certainly, to the extent that you consider yourself an artist, or you are somebody who commercializes or whose economic well-being is dependent on your intellectual property, it's
Yeah.
certainly a piece of legislation that I would recommend anybody in that particular field to ensure that they at least come to a position of understanding what it's about. Because when it comes time to make representations, remember, the people that are ordinarily sitting in parliament are politicians. Yes, they do tend to at times have experts that are advising them on the subject matter, but in terms
Yeah.
of what some of the unintended consequences may be, only artists would be able to say, actually, this is how it should rather be framed, because in its current form, these are some of the defects. I'll give you one example. So
Yes.
as far as musicians are concerned, there was a time when the Copyright Amendment Bill wanted to ensure that if it's a performance right, there must be only one collecting society. If it's a right to broadcast content, there must only be one collecting society. And the
Right.
musician said, don't, but hang on, that won't really work for us. You know, we want to
Mm.
be able to engage with different collecting societies that would be able to ensure that we get the maximum return.
No, this is
Because
true.
of
Yeah.
course, not all of them are necessarily regulated by the CIPC under the Department of Trade and Industry. So
Hmm.
there are always those particular issues that unless you are in the industry, you won't really understand. And then unfortunately, when a legislation is passed and it doesn't quite work out, some of the
Mm.
challenges that we then face is not everyone can afford lawyers, right? So you
This is
sit with continued exploitation simply because the letter of the legislation has those unintended consequences.
great stuff. And thanks for that example, because I think, it also sees to people having the right to create. You speak about the right to
Exactly.
own, amongst other things. And that then becomes important. I mean, we on Instagram now, someone drops a picture and then, screenshot, it goes viral and stuff like that.
Exactly.
Those ownership issues associated with that. But,
Precisely.
what then has been, in your view and what you've seen, these submissions in Parliament? What really, if you were to just put
Okay.
it high level, what
Yeah.
really are the artists asking for? So that's the first
Mm-hmm.
part. The second part is what then is, the department, for example, is saying or doing, or the legislature, amongst other things.
Okay, so on one hand, as far as what the artists are saying, the artists want to be able to commercialize to the maximum ability their works.
Yeah,
And that really speaks to the ownership of their works because for as long as you don't own anything, the ability for you to monetize and commercialize is then limited. So some of them have been talking about the implications of the contracts. Some of them have been talking about their inability to commercialize on repeats because they had
yes,
ceded those rights to be it a broadcaster or a film producer.
right.
And you know, we sometimes have to be very honest and as far as you can't just sign a contract, right? So much
Mm.
as yes, there has to be an enabling legislative framework. It's unfortunate because we've had instances where some people come after the fact and we're very happy to sign off the contract
Yes,
and get a lump sum amount of X amount,
yes,
right?
this
And
is true.
then later on, they want to commercialize their content. But hang on, you've actually
They're locked
ceded
in.
the ownership
Yeah,
over. They're locked in. So that's
yeah,
why I say there's always two parts, and legislation can really not fix everything. But
this is true.
insofar as answering your question, you know, so there's been the artist saying we want to have greater moral and economic rights over our content. And that is why then the Copyright Amendment Bill made it possible for artists to start having royalties or be able to claim royalties for their
Yeah,
creative works, right? But then the
yeah,
challenge then becomes when that particular provision was developed, it was developed in such a way that the only level of remuneration would then be in the form of a royalty. But I mean, on the
hmm,
other hand, you want to have the flexibility of negotiating either getting a royalty or getting a lump
yeah,
sum payment. And so
correct.
there's always been those particular issues because, on one hand, and I do sympathize with the legislator, on one hand, you have a creative sector crying out and saying we're being exploited and
Yeah,
there's no recourse, and the legislation right now is not favoring us, and the legislation also is not enabling, taking into consideration technology and all of these developments. So there is that pressure to respond and to be seen to actually ensure that the creators of these particular works are able to commercialize. But there have unfortunately always been those challenges in terms of how do you actually formulate the legislation in such a way that it is clear who owns the intellectual property at which point in time, because that'll
mm,
determine
mm,
whether or not you'll be able to continuously commercialize it, you know. And that's why
yeah,
sometimes you see people wanting certain content to now be made a film. There was,
yes,
I think, last year a big call for Yizo Yizo to be made a film.
right.
And I even had a good chat with one of, I think, yeah, one of the stars of the show.
Yes,
But now it became a challenge because the rights were still held by another party. And so the people who actually gave the rights to the broadcaster gave it
mm,
to such an extended period of time that 10 or
yeah,
more years later,
yeah.
they still don't
They'd
have
still be
rights
left.
and they're not able
Yeah,
to commercialize it.
yeah. No, I hear you. And this is the thing. So I think also that there needs to be sort of a movement and an awareness in relation to artists. You know, they need to start
Yes.
grouping themselves and coming together
Yeah.
and saying our struggles are the same, right? We all want the same
Yes.
thing to a certain extent. And I know that, I mean, I just forgot his name, or rather, character name, Rajesh Kumar, as they would call it.
Oh,
You
yes,
know,
from SA Guild.
yes, yes, yes.
Yes.
You know, he's trying his part insofar as
Yeah.
making sure people are coming together, they speak with one voice and stuff like that. But you know, ordinarily these type of contracts then become difficult to get out of it, you know, because you'd
Yes.
have been locked in a long time ago.
Yeah.
But given that
Yeah.
we're dealing with an apartheid type of legislation, as you correctly pointed out, surely because we've moved on and there's, you know, modern legislation, freedom of expression and creativity, maybe one of the things that ought to be considered while some of them crowdfund this is a possible litigation of some sort where at least it can protect them, and open up those old contract and make sure that they at least meet, you know, legality in this current stance. You know, don't you think that's something maybe that could be looked at? Or if you signed, you know, and you are screwed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You see, here's the challenge, and in the Copyright Amendment Bill, it actually seeks
Mm.
to right the wrong of the past, if I can use that phrase, in that
Right.
some of the provisions have a retrospective application. That means if the bill was to be passed now, a creator can then start claiming royalty. But to me,
Yeah.
here's the practical question that we have to ask ourselves. If that's the case, one, you've been paid, right, for that contract. So are you going to give back the money? and then we start with the royalties. And also,
Yeah.
how far back do you go? And some of these contracts, remember, there's been an on session where you and I can enter into that contract, and I can cede all of my intellectual property rights to you over a film, for example. Then later on, you want to cede it to somebody else who's going to create a book out of it, or they decide to just distribute it to someone else. Now, when the legislation is passed that says you can open up old contracts, how do we then start tracking back, especially where the ownership has moved from one party to another party, and there's always been that exchange of sum or remuneration against the intellectual property rights itself? So that is really the difficulty about having any retrospective application. Never mind the fact that you have to have very clear grounds and compelling grounds as to why you would want there to be retrospective application, because as the president eloquently put it in his letter to the Speaker of the National Assembly, that really is an appropriation of property, in the same way that we're talking about, land and appropriation. It's exactly the same thing. It's just that with intellectual property, it's intangible, but it carries just as much weight as tangible property or immovable property for that matter. So if you are going to have that appropriation of property, you have to really have a compelling case. And at this point, given that people have been paid at each and every instance, how do you then reopen contracts and work it backwards? So those are some of the practical implications.
Yeah. But I think, I like the fact that, we do appreciate it as lawyers, for example, that it is type of property, right, amongst other things. But surely, and it's a difficult one, you're right, where money was exchanged, and if we were to treat, or rather think of it as land, what we're doing with the redistribution of land, amongst other things, with IP, it becomes very difficult somehow, because, if we were to say we are going to monetize or pay back, what would be the equivalence of that, and who is liable to pay, and stuff like that. From your experience, though, the broadcasters, are they taking a stance in terms of this? Are they in support of this type of thing, or this is one of those bills that will take them out of business, and therefore they might as well exploit as much as they can now, so that when everything else changes, they are able to jump ship and having made as much?
So broadcasters, and I'm not speaking on behalf of any broadcasters in particular, so I have to put that caveat there.
I like that.
But certainly, because to me, they're going to go onto Twitter.
Sit down, screenshot, it goes in.
Yes, exactly, and say she said, but be that as...
on that point also, this is not legal advice or anything.
Guys.
If anyone wants that, they need to then, approach an attorney or otherwise, and cannot rely on this discussion as part of legal advice or otherwise. So maybe I should have I'd say
standard caveat.
But yeah, please go ahead.
Sure. So broadcasters they do support this process. And generally, I must say that even those people that have particular issues with certain aspects of the bill, they do actually support the objectives of the bill. And I think one thing that we have to bear in mind is broadcasters bear the risk quite a lot of the time, because you can sell a production to a broadcaster. Whether or not the broadcaster makes their return, it's not your business. You've given them the content, they've given you the money, and then you part ways. It's then for the broadcaster to carry the cost of the advertising. It's then for the broadcaster to ensure that they market the product. If it's getting it into an international content distribution domain, it's often incumbent upon the broadcaster to do that, so that they can get their return. And that is why you find that from a time point of view, these contracts, as far as the cession of the rights, it's over a prolonged period of time, because broadcasters generally make their money from advertising revenue, generally, unless if it's a subscription one. So they are certainly in support of it, and we would have seen that at every turn, they're always actually advertising about how they've gone over and above in supporting the creative sector. But again, it's always the practical implications of some of these provisions. So if there's a provision, for instance, that tells you that your contract has to have these particular provisions, and one of the more problematic clauses that I can give you an example of, and I think you can appreciate this to me as a lawyer, is it's currently, if you create content by virtue of a commercial arrangement, the person who
Yes.
pays for the content automatically owns the copyright, which makes sense, right? So currently the Copyright Amendment Bill says, actually, if you pay for content, you don't necessarily own it. You and the person that you have commissioned the content from have to come to a decision as to who owns the content. And if you can't decide who owns the content, then it has to go before a commissioner. And that is, oh, and then on top of that, the Copyright Amendment Bill says you cannot contract out of any of the provisions. So unfortunately, it then creates a very rigid framework, and it goes against some of the established principles of the freedom to contract. And it's not to
100%.
say that broadcasters want to be overly prescriptive, or they don't want people to enjoy the benefits of provisions that seek to protect people. But I think it goes both ways. You have to ensure that you seek legal advice. And there are a lot of these representative organizations within the creative sector. There's your independent production organizations, there's your SASFIT, there's a whole host of them. The question then becomes to me, what are they doing to protect their own members? I mean, you spoke of Rajesh Kumar. I'm sorry, I also can't remember his name. He's
I
from SA.
apologize.
Yes,
Yeah,
and I mean,
but yeah,
SA Guild has really been very vocal about the concerns of the creatives, and correctly so. That is their fraternity. Those are their they're representing very specific interests. But I've
yeah,
always wondered, what level of support do they give to their members beyond
yeah,
just making representations in Parliament?
yes.
You can ask the same
Is
of
it
any
legal
collective
advice? Is
society.
it, contract reviews
Precisely.
and stuff like that,
Precisely.
So yeah, no,
Exactly.
I
Because
hear
I
you.
mean,
So mm,
yeah, because
no,
some of
please go
these
ahead.
challenges
Yeah.
could also be circumvented by that type of support being rendered, because we understand that legal advice can be quite costly, especially
Yes.
because creatives at times really literally survive from one content to another, from one production to another. And if they
Yeah.
pitch it and a broadcaster does not take it, then unfortunately that means that that particular source of income is no longer viable. So we get that. But we are all part of the same ecosystem. And
Yeah.
so if you really say that you are protecting the interests of a particular sector, you have to go the full 9 yards, and you have to then see how do you start, whether they have to then pay certain fees so that there is a kitty of sort, and from that kitty they can then use for legal advice fees, so be it. But it's very layered, to me, if I can put
Yeah.
it like that. It's quite layered.
No, definitely, and thanks for that. I think that's key and important in relation to that. And we need this. Instead of various or two voices or three organizations in all of this. And I think what sometimes I see is the awareness in relation to legislation, be it bills, be it acts, or anything for that matter. That's what's lacking. And what we often get
Yes.
is the high level aspect of it, right? And
Yeah.
say, but okay, sure, X is doing Y, and it's really ripping people off. Whereas there are these
Yes.
things that you are pointing out, amongst other things. But you speak also about the dispute resolution clauses and mechanisms
Yeah.
in terms of this thing. Also, it goes back to the issue of awareness and empowering people in terms of rights and stuff like that.
Yes.
But what is
Yeah.
the state of the bill as we're sitting here today and having this discussion? Are we seeing it, making traction? Is it going to become an act of some sort,
Yeah.
and something that is binding, or it's still going to be, in Parliament to and from and stuff like that?
Okay. So the act had gone all the way to the president's office,
Yeah.
meaning that it was passed by both houses of parliament. It was passed by the National Assembly, and then thereafter they passed it on to the second house of parliament. They passed it. They said, yes, we're happy with this legislation. Please, Mr. President, sign it into law. And it sat on his desk for quite a few months, I must say, because it
Yeah.
was passed in February. Yeah, it was passed in February, and I think, yeah, anyway, I can't remember exactly when the NCOP passed it, but they were satisfied with it, and it went to the president's desk, and it was then incumbent upon him to consider whether or not to pass it.
Yeah.
And there was even threatened litigation, because now it was taking some time for us to get feedback on that particular issue. On the 16th of July, no, on the 16th of June, excuse me,
Dude, I
the
was about to
president
say,
wrote, Yeah,
But I can
sorry.
speak. It's okay.
Yes. The president then wrote a letter to the Speaker of the National Assembly citing his concerns around the bill in itself and said that in its current form he cannot sign it. And he sent
Yeah.
it back to the Speaker of the National Assembly. So fortunately, it will
Yeah.
not be signed in its current form because
Okay.
to me, as a legal professional, that legislation is flawed, both
Yeah.
procedurally and substantively. And so it's
Right.
then incumbent upon the National Assembly to then give directive. Are they
Yeah.
going to compel or request the DTI, which is the ministry that's running with this process, to start afresh? And are they going to now involve more extensively the expert panel that
Yeah.
they had? Are they going to
Yeah.
then open up for various people to then make their input? And I must emphasize and underscore the point that you made earlier about representations on
Yeah.
legislation. It may seem like a very mundane process. It may seem a bit technical. One might think that it's by default, it should only be something that lawyers have a concern with or are interested in. But if you are in the creative sector, I urge you, you have to actually make sure that you participate in these legislative review processes, because it is in the name of the creative sector that this particular legislation was brought even to the National Assembly to begin with. And at every turn, it's always been in the interest of the creative sector, these particular provisions have to be made. And the creative sector has always been used as the reason to even advocate quite strongly for the president to
Mm.
sign it. So it
Mm.
can't be something that's left for us lawyers. Yes, I enjoy it. It
Yeah.
gives me a thrill. But at the
Yeah.
end of the day, I'm not a creator.
Of
And it
course.
won't impact me as much as it'll impact
Yes.
anybody who's seeking to monetize their intellectual property.
Yeah. So, and I think that's really a powerful thing, getting involved, knowing what the status is, being in a position to express views. Some people, be it an influencer or otherwise, who are listening and joining in, or probably would see this. If you are managed, speak to your manager and say, dude, what
Yes,
does this mean for me in the next 5 years when we are sitting, despite the agreement that we have, with the content? Will I be able to still survive on a cooking show or content that I put, yeah,
precisely.
stuff like that, and those then become real, things to discuss. But I think we've really went 360 with this, and we looked at it, and it's really going to remain one of those contentious issues, right? We know, for example, that there was a story regarding someone who recently passed on, actually, and had child artist money
Oh,
and stuff.
yes, yes, yes,
Yes,
yes. The
you know,
Living
and
Legends Fund.
you know what I mean? And it just shows you historically, as you correctly pointed out earlier, that this thing has history from,
Yeah.
70s and stuff like that. Things are being done by government, at least to try and establish these type of things like Legends Fund and stuff. But the corruption, like what
Yes,
we're seeing in the Eastern Cape, amongst other things, it's insane. And I think it's for the artists also not to hold back, especially those who are impacted, to make sure that they are vocal about these things. They call out what it is, and make
exactly.
sure that they put pressure on law enforcement to act. Because at the end of the day, these are bread and butter issues, right? And if it's not done properly, the kids will be asking why, you were this famous person number of years,
Exactly.
or I can see now
Yes,
what gives, whereas there's this complication that is happening and it's not being attended to. So, to
hmm.
the creatives that's listening and who are going to be sharing this, amongst other things, get involved, attend
Yeah,
those briefing sessions, attend the consultation that is going to happen. I think if you look at stuff like COVID, we're not going to be as normal as we are from doing business or otherwise. And most of them have technology, these creatives, and some of these things will be live streamed. You'd have to join in on that
exactly.
stuff. That's where you can join in, make your voice heard, organize
Yep,
yourselves. Instead of having 100 of you, have 5 points that you know that these are material and this is what's going to, maybe make your point or your voices be heard. But this is very important to be involved. And this also applies to any type of legislation, any type of
exactly.
act, amongst other things. And it doesn't help us to sit here, complain about the Eastern Cape, amongst other things, or anything for that matter, and we don't even appear anywhere
Yep.
to raise views, to talk about how this
Yes.
suddenly aid and stuff like that. And we need to also just hold our leaders accountable. I think there's one thing where they sit in, sometimes they're like, nothing's going to happen to me, you know. So
Yeah.
we really have to do our part in that regard. I'm not sure if there are questions, but I think, you know, from a high level perspective and where we're sitting, I'm just scrolling through the comments. Tulani Bafana, we see you. Thank you for tuning in. Says he's very inspired. That's probably a creative coming. And
And it's an open forum, you know, to me,
yeah,
whilst you're just going through the comments there, as far as making submissions is concerned. And when it comes also to using some of the platforms and avenues that we have, law clinics are for free, guys. Let me just put it out there. You can go, if you are within the Joburg Center, you can always go to the Wits Clinic, law clinic. If you're around Pretoria, you can go. Universities generally have a law clinic, and that is a free legal service that you can use. So they can actually also even assist you when it comes to some of the contracts that you have, to understand what some of the clauses are. And we understand the economic pressure that sometimes artists have when they want to make as much money as possible on a particular publication or on a particular production, because, you know, life, unfortunately, you never know what's going to hit you next. But rather take the time to understand exactly what the legal implications are. I mean, we've seen, to me, artists actually have to change their stage names, because when they left their record company, they didn't realize that even their stage name actually belonged to the record company. Yes, exactly. So that just goes to show you the level of detail that intellectual property has in copyright. And imagine if you spend years and years and years ramping up your profile, being known as hashtag Tumi Sole, and Tumi decides that actually I'm going to establish my own brand. I want to be a self-publicating office, artist, excuse me. Now actually let me go and establish my own so that I can actually kikemele, so to speak, and be a bit more independent. And they're like, yeah, sure, but just leave the Tumi Sole at the door. Now you have to start from scratch. You literally have to start from scratch. And that's why I always say, I might sound like a broken record, but it's not because I'm saying, guys, we need to be paid more as lawyers, but it's because we understand some of the implications and long-term consequences. If you can just take the time to negotiate and understand what the implications of your contract are. And we've seen even now with the Vodacom, please call me, that in itself has been a bit of a development, because, you know, at the beginning, Tumi, you spoke about the standard clause that we have in our employment, that which you create during your employment period belongs to your employer. And, you know, the courts are saying, hang on, but that's only if what you created is within the scope of what you are employed for. So if you're not employed to do something, but you do it outside of your working hours, and it so happens to benefit your employer, that is a separate commercial contract altogether, you know? So, and right now we do a lot. Social media, as well as I'd say technology at large, has allowed us to be three-dimensional individuals. You know, you can be a lawyer by day, influencer by night. There's just a lot more that it allows you to do and engage and communicate on and be a part of. And so you have to start thinking about what are the implications of this as far as some of my contractual obligations. If you're saying, yes, I can enter into this particular separate contract because it's got nothing to do with my job, it's not even in the same industry, I'm going to be able to make so much. It's not always so cut and dry, unfortunately. And we see it now with the Please Call Me. We've seen now with artists losing their names and having to start afresh insofar as their public identity is concerned. So it's not really something that I think as a creative, you can afford to be complacent on.
No, definitely. And I think that's actually a nice parting shot. So while you create and trend and be out there, start thinking for the future, right? And what the implications may be for you where you sit in. Some of you have commercial agreements with your managers, for example. Some are independent and stuff like that. But if you are looking at establishing your own identity, start thinking, you know, 5 years from now, will it be sustainable? Will I still be known as this? And the nice thing with the likes of Instagram, one checks a hashtag, you still go back and you'll see that type of content. And what then happens, which is an injustice, is all those things being taken by someone else, amongst other things,
Yeah.
and you not having those rights. And we'll always know you are as that guy that used to do 1, 2, and 3. Don is asking a question. It's far-fetched. Can art schools, universities equally claim work you might have started during your study years? Tholoana, what do you think? I think it depends on the circumstances,
Yeah.
right? And what were you
Yes.
doing amongst other things?
Yes. Yeah.
Were you employed by the university, for example,
Exactly.
as an art teacher or
Yeah.
so, or but look of it, and then suddenly you now become this famous artist, and then they could just say this is our part. So there's definitely some background info that is important that would be required for one to look at
Yeah.
those.
And if I can just add there, it also depends. So generally, for instance, especially when you are at undergrad as well as master's level or postgrad, let me just put it like that. Oftentimes, when it comes to your dissertation, there is a clause that indicates that you don't have exclusive rights over your dissertation or your thesis or your publication, because essentially what that does is it gives the university or that particular academic institution rights to continuously publish your work without necessarily having to ask for your consent. It's not to
Yeah.
say that they would go out of their way to commercialize it. They're just saying we want to be able to publish your work and make use of it and make reference to it without necessarily always having to go the traditional route that they would have if you had exclusive rights to that particular content.
100%. No, Turan, I think, the discussion is quite helpful, and we could sit here and talk about too many practical examples and the unfortunate incidents that we are seeing as we speak,
Yeah.
in the dispensation, in social media platforms and stuff like that. But for me, I think we've really touched on the high level aspect of this bill. We've also emphasized on when you are creating, start thinking long term. When you sign
Yeah.
contracts, they put 1.5 million rand there. You need to start saying, what does this mean for me 5 years from now? And will I still be making money out of it and stuff like that? So I think that's quite useful, and it's a proper parting shot. I don't have much on my end, and I don't know if there's anything you want to close this thing with or say to the masses that have joined us.
Read your contracts, guys. Read your contracts, be it your employment contract, be it your influencer contract, be it your I want to use your face or voice contract, because at the end of the day, you want to have as much control, if I can put it like that, as possible. But if anything, you have to have a thorough understanding. The minute you sign, you cannot then turn around and say, sorry, I didn't know. And it applies to everything. It's the same if you were taking a cell phone contract out and they start billing you for something else and they tell you, well, look at clause 4.1.3. So if you're going to take the time out to engage in any sort of activities that have intellectual property right implications, rather do the right thing. Speak to somebody, ask them to have a look at their contract. Generally, they won't do it for free. But as to me, you've correctly said, it's really about what are the long-term implications of this, especially if it's a field that you are looking to have a sense of longevity over, and actually just say that this is where some of my economic livelihood is going to come from. So definitely, guys. And once again, the president has signed the bill back. We're not quite sure what's going to happen right now because it is a national state of disaster. We do have an NCC, and all things have been given some sort of priority insofar as they're related to COVID-19 and just managing this pandemic. And on that note, guys, stay safe, sanitize, physical distance. I don't like saying social distance. It's physical distance, social solidarity, and keep safe.
Thank you so much, Tholoana, and really thanks to everyone who's joined in. And we hope that, this session has imparted some knowledge. As I said when I started, that's the whole point about this discussion: give out information ordinarily that one would have to pay for, which is not legal advice, but just imparting, some info and let people in terms of what is happening in various spaces and stuff. And to the content creators, all the best, guys. Seek out, reach out, and make money, but do so, and say, what is the long-term impact, and don't settle. I think sometimes when they want you, they will have you.
Yes,
You need to come with your
exactly.
terms and say, these are my terms and this is what I want from it. And just maybe before I part, amongst other things, is, there's these non-exclusive clauses, amongst other things,
Yeah.
non-compete, and read those, because you could be approached by a football brand and all of those things, and then
Yes.
you are now locked in, and then 3 years later you either have a restraint or something like that, and you can't even go anywhere, and you're not earning some money. So read about those things and see what is happening. Someone is asking, what's the best advice you can give about starting an organization with others have the skilled labor and you're responsible for it? IP, we should speak to you about how to structure it. I think let's just have that, drop it here, and let's discuss that. There are various intellectual property lawyers and stuff. I think we also have a greater calling to assist where we can, and make
Yes.
reference and refer people to your law clinics, for example, for them to be able to assist and stuff like that. In starting organizations, one always has to think about sustainability. You are
Yeah.
fired out now, you are thinking about it, and then nothing happens in 6 months, or just one incident, you get discouraged. So it's all those things. Instead of just starting and stuff, think also about, why do you want to start this type of organization? What does it mean?
Sure.
Is there something in existence that is similar to what you're doing? How about you collaborate with those type of people and say, how can we build and take it forward? But thank you guys, and thank you for tuning in. We appreciate it, and apologies for starting a little late. Technology
Yes.
dealt with us, but we managed, and that's why
You
we are here.
did.
We are going to leave this on our Instagram, IG, TV, and you will then be able to watch at your own time and see how you share it. And do share, follow us, we'll follow you back, and let's keep the conversation going.
Definitely. And stay
Thank
safe,
you very
Tumi.
much.
Take care.
You too. Hey, chat soon.
Thank you. Cool.
All right.
Ciao. Bye.
You can log off. I'm trying to figure out something here. And if
I'll
I could
end the
say, please
video
just
on my
click save.
side.
Ne? Yeah, and also just
Yeah.
click save so it can stay on your
Okay.
IG TV as well. All right.
Okay, cool.
Cheers. Sure.
Cheers, friend.